Perhaps it was the rush to get in before the border closes, but immigration from Europe has hit an all-time high. Is Brexit the answer? Well, perhaps, but the minister in charge made another admission today. We might go on making those payments to the EU after all. Also on News at 10 tonight. Abuse in football. The scandal grows and grows as the new England manager salutes the courage of the victims.
The bravery of the players that have come forward is exceptional, and to hear the stories is heartbreaking, really.
Hopeless Hollande. The French president says he won't stand again, confirming his place as the most unpopular leader of his country in modern history. The heartbreaking footage of the crew and passengers who were soon to die. And never too old to make new friends. The 89-year-old back at work today to beat his boredom.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. In the weeks before the EU referendum, immigration became the hottest of all political hot potatoes. It was just never where it was supposed to be, which, according to David Cameron, was somewhere down in the tens of thousands. Indeed, there was much heated discussion about whether we even knew what it really was and whether official figures could be relied upon. Well, it turns out that just as we were voting, the number of people coming here reached a record high, at least according to figures out today. For the 12 months to the end of June, the week after the vote, 284,000 people arrived here from the rest of the European Union. The overall total was nearly 2/3 also the highest ever.
There are many things about Brexit which, 6 months after the Leave win, remain as clear as mud. But on migration, the much-promised taking back control has clearly not happened yet. So on a day of high numbers, the government says immigration won't come down until we're no longer in the EU.
I don't think there's any great surprise that the figures are pretty much flatlining, and of course the opportunity to really affect the numbers coming from the European Union will only flow from the deal we make following the Brexit negotiations.
In the year to the end of June, 650,000 people arrived in the UK, the highest number ever recorded. Net migration, those arriving minus those leaving, was 335,000, close to the all-time high. From just within the EU, another record, 284,000 arrived in the UK, and 82,000 of them did not have a job to come to. In England, no town outside London is growing faster than Corby. Population growth 17%. Housing developments, there are many. Part of that growth has been from Eastern Europe.
I come 2004. I was very young and now I feel home here.
Like many people in Corby, Brigitte Balagova is from Eastern Europe. And even in the decade she's lived here, she's noticed more pressure on public services.
Problem with the doctors, yeah.
Yes.
Doctors. Sometimes when it's something I want to call, it's always busy.
And on the day of high migration figures, we discovered the Home Office under Theresa May's leadership has twice tried to push through a plan to remove school places from the children of illegal migrants.
No, I don't understand that at all. I mean, you can't blame anything on the kids. They're innocents, aren't they?
I think it's terrible. Don't condemn kids for what adults do.
Parents in Corby didn't much care for the plan when we asked them, but Mrs May, as Home Secretary, tried to do it in 2015 after the election and in 2013 during the coalition.
I think Theresa May was supportive of the plans to force parents to state their immigration status before their child could be registered, but the Home Office and the then Prime Minister David Cameron were pushing this very hard. Others in government, not just the Liberal Democrats, were frankly sceptical about this.
Add into the immigration mix today the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who on a trip to Rome had to deny he was, after all, in favour of the EU's free movement of people. Reports claimed he'd said as much to a group of ambassadors.
I'm in favour of immigration. I think immigration has been a good thing for London and for the UK, but we've got to have control, and the point of Brexit is we're taking back control.
Not surprisingly, this prominent Brexit campaigner was keen to put a lid on the story.
Take back control.
That take-back control message persuaded a third of people in Corby to vote leave last June. They wait to see if and when Brexit will deliver control of migration. Chris Ship, News at 10, Corby.
If immigration was one big factor influencing the Brexit vote, another was the claim from the Leave campaign that we'd save billions of pounds in budget contributions if we left, 350 million a week to be precise. The figure was even painted on the side of the so-called Boris bus. You probably remember. But today, the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, said Britain could actually carry on paying into EU coffers to retain access to the single market.
So what's in them? Is there raisins in them?
Yes, we've got currants.
For the Brexit Secretary today, the tough negotiations were mostly with a hot griddle. But the man who's said to want to have his cake and eat it regarding an EU deal has at least now offered to pay for it, telling one Labour MP this morning Britain could keep shelling out to maintain free trade.
Will the government consider making any contribution in any shape or form for access to the single market?
The major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market. And if that is included in what you're talking about, then of course we would consider it.
Which isn't exactly the promise written on the side of this campaign bus during the referendum, or pledged by the Leave camp on board.
We'll take back control of the £350 million that we send to the European Union every week.
But is the Brexit Secretary prepared to break that pledge?
He was part of a campaign that made clear promises to the public that £350 million a week could be saved and paid to the NHS. Now we find that he's saying some of that money, at least, may have to be paid into market access.
It's calculated that in 2014 the UK paid £14.4 billion in membership fees to the EU. If we were to leave but stay in the single market, we might still have to pay, and perhaps not a lot less. For example, Norway's access to the single market costs them around £740 million a year. Per head, that's around 2/3 of what the UK pays. Tonight, Downing Street is standing by the Brexit Secretary's comments here in the Commons, arguing it only makes sense for the government to keep its options open while it tries to get the best deal for Britain. But it is difficult to see how this particular option would satisfy anyone on either side of the Brexit debate.
The United Kingdom sends £350 million of tax.
In fact, some Brexiteers are just as loath to break this promise.
If it was to happen, of course, people will be very, very cross about it. But it isn't going to happen. So as much as the media want to make it that way, it isn't going to happen.
But David Davis still doesn't know quite how Brexit is going to turn out. And this wouldn't be the first flip of a campaign promise. Paul Brandt, News at 10, Westminster.
And Chris Ship is here now to make some sense of this, or try. We've been here before. So David Davis seemed to be quite frank today, talking about potentially going on paying into the EU. Was that a kind of, we have to keep all options open, or a bit of a hint?
Well, you know, Tom, there were so many Brexit stories around today, I didn't really know where to begin. There was the whole thing we've just been talking about migration and population growth. There was Boris on free movement, and then paying into the EU. And you sort of have to say, hold on a minute, paying into the EU after we left. Didn't we have a whole referendum campaign, which was all about ending payments to the EU? I think what we've got here really, at the heart of all this, is how we square that circle between controlling our borders and still having what the government says is our best possible access to the single market. And I think what those figures did today, what they will embolden Theresa May. She thinks the vote to leave last June was essentially about migration. She's going to want to control migration, and I simply think those figures will embolden her. In other words, David Davis is going to have to sit there and say, well, actually, if we're going to control migration and control our borders, we're going to have to be a little bit more realistic about having to pay the EU to get access to the single market.
Now, you talk to a lot of people who think this deal, whatever it is, it may take years and years and years. And I noticed that David Davis spent quite a lot of time talking about transition arrangements today. Is your best guess that we might have one arrangement for transition and potentially a long way to wait for a deal?
My best guess, and it's only a fairly early stage and everything's a guess at the moment, the government says they're not going to give a running commentary, but sort of every time David Davis goes up into the Commons and start talking, we've got a running commentary. Look, you've got 2 years of the negotiation. He did spend a lot of time talking about transition. We're going to have to move to something at the end of that period in 2019. We don't yet know what that's going to be. I sort of think this whole thing about having your cake and eating it, David Davis was sort of saying today we might have to buy a bit of the cake back if we still want to eat it after it's gone.
OK, it's an analogy we're going to take a long way, I think, in the next year. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, we have probably still some way to go before the true scale of child sexual abuse in football becomes clear, but there are now 17 police forces investigating. One of them, Greater Manchester, has identified 10 suspects. The New England manager, Gareth Southgate, talked about the crisis at his first press conference in the job. He was full of praise for the former players who've come forward.
The tentacles of this scandal extend further and burrow deeper by the day. Former players continue to relive past horrors, and as they do, crimes are unearthed that have been buried for decades. Today at his unveiling, Gareth Southgate reflected on the courage of those players and acknowledged the scale of the growing crisis.
The bravery of the players that have come forward is exceptional, and you know, to hear the stories is heartbreaking, really. It's the important thing over the next few weeks is that we still investigate what had happened, that we learn from the past, and I must also say that, you know, if I'm a parent sending my child to a game over the weekend, I feel that they're in a much better place than we were 15, 20 years ago.
Around 350 victims have now come forward to report sex abuse in football clubs. In the last week, there have been more than 860 calls to a dedicated helpline to support them. And now, 17 police forces have confirmed they're investigating allegations of abuse.
Hello, you're through to an advisor at the NSPCC helpline.
While the majority of calls relate to historical claims, not all do.
Certainly, the nature of the concerns and the calls and the contacts that we're getting relate to historic and non-recent abuse, but also current concerns and situations as well.
Today, Northumbria Police launched Operation Tide into non-recent abuse at Newcastle United. One of the cases they're investigating, David Eatock, abused by his youth coach George Ormond, who was subsequently convicted of child sex abuse. Eatock believes there must have been those who knew what was going on.
I genuinely believe somebody was maybe not aware of the severity of the abuse, but definitely there was something not right about this guy. I, hand on heart, believe that. And that makes me really angry.
The FA confirmed today it is monitoring claims Chelsea paid hush money to a victim abused by a coach there in the 1970s. And there was a warning to any club who has bought silence.
What should happen to clubs, do you think, if they have had these contracts in place?
If there are restrictive contracts through employment law which prevent people from speaking out about a crime, because we're talking about crimes here, then it must be dealt with. And the primacy needs to be clear, though. Where do the police get involved, and then where do the FA?
The national game is coming to terms with an unprecedented crisis, and it's pretty clear there is more pain to come. Much more. Steve Scott, News at 10.
That really gets more and more disturbing, if that's possible. But overseas now, and tradition in French politics dictates that a first-term president stands for re-election for a second, even if the odds of winning it don't look too good. But Francois Hollande tonight told his supporters, not that there are many of them these days, that he will not stand again. He is at least assured of a place in history, though, as the most unpopular president ever. Policy U-turns, high unemployment and poor economic growth did for his reputation. And his secret scooter visits to a new partner didn't help either. The French election is getting interesting, to say the least.
Looking tired and sombre, Francois Hollande made his shock announcement directly to the French people, becoming the first sitting president in the country's modern history not to seek re-election. Such a contrast to the surge of enthusiasm which swept him to power in 2012. Promising an end to austerity, President Hollande presented himself as a man of the people. But his muddled policies led to him becoming the least popular president since the Second World War.
The fact that he finally acknowledges that his candidacy would actually hinder and undermine the French left further means that at least he gives chances perhaps to his Prime Minister Manuel Valls, but other people on the left.
His rise through the ranks of left-wing politics has ended in failure. A recent book contains a series of bizarre, frustrated quotes from him, criticising his rivals, calling Nicolas Sarkozy a Duracell bunny. His handling of the terror attacks in Paris and Nice were widely criticised. His Prime Minister jeered by crowds at a memorial ceremony. Although he oversaw historic achievements like the Paris Climate Change Agreement and legalising gay marriage, unemployment remained stubbornly high. His approval rating slumped as low as 4%, even when it was revealed he had a glamorous mistress, almost de rigueur in French politics. His clumsy attempts to keep their affair secret were seen as ridiculous. His decision not to run weakens his Socialist Party, strengthens the chances of Conservative leader Francois Hollande, a self-declared fan of Thatcherism, and will also spur on the far right, led by Marine Le Pen, ahead of the presidential elections next April. The president's decision to retreat from the battle ahead can only raise the risk of defeat for the left in France. Angus Walker, News at 10.
For 5 days now, rebel forces under siege in the Syrian city of Aleppo have been losing ground to President Assad's army. A sorry procession of people have been forced from what remains of their homes in what were rebel-held areas. Well, today, the United Nations said around 30,000 have been displaced in the past few days alone. It is desperately hoping to get more out alive.
The noose is tightening on rebels in the east. Today, the Syrian army claimed to have taken another district. Tanks and heavy weapons blasting away at a rapidly shrinking rebel enclave. In the areas the government's retaken, desolation, a heavy price paid for each street. And there are now tens of thousands of displaced people, many injured, all hungry, who are thankful to have escaped alive.
For a long time we wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let us, and thank God they opened the route out for us.
Today the UN said there was hope other trapped civilians would be given safe passage out of East Aleppo.
The Russian Federation announced that there are 4 humanitarian corridors that they want to sit down now in Aleppo with our people there to discuss how we can use the 4 corridors to evacuate people out, especially we have at least 400 wounded that need immediate medical evacuation.
But every day there are reminders that sentiment has failed in Syria. These 2 brothers, Gaith and Bilal, were among the latest slew of victims today, killed by Syrian army shells as they slept. And Anas al-Bashir, who brought smiles to children in East Aleppo dressing as a clown, today died from his injuries sustained earlier this week. For those who have made it out of East Aleppo, there is an end to the hunger at least, but many are now homeless and profoundly traumatised, winter compounding their misery for a people that have suffered so much. Dan Rivers, News at 10.
Many of the Syrians fleeing the fighting make their way, as we've often reported, towards Turkey and onwards, or so they hope, through Europe. But today, Turkey's President Erdogan said that if the EU doesn't fulfil its promises on his country's membership, he might think again about stopping refugees heading to Greece and other EU countries. On average, thousands of Syrians flee their country every day. An estimated 4.8 million have left since the war began 5 years ago. 1.2 million have already crossed into Europe, but 2.7 million are still in Turkey.
On the streets of Turkey's towns and cities, so much of the refugee crisis is contained. In the Mediterranean port of Izmir, there's now a Syrian neighbourhood. The people here make livings in the black economy, where wages are low and rents are high. So a new life in Europe is still something to dream of.
It's difficult to live here. That's why I want to go to Europe, because they help with housing and everything.
Jihan, her husband Khalil and their young daughter escaped Aleppo. Now they live in Izmir in one room.
The government here tells us not to go to Europe because the crossing is dangerous and we might get detained. But people still go. They don't care if they die, so long as they get out of Turkey.
The Turkish Navy patrols the waters off Izmir as part of a deal to stem the flow of refugees in return for financial support from the EU. But European criticism of the Turkish government's crackdown on political opposition following a coup attempt earlier this year has drawn an angry response from President Erdogan, who's threatened to back out of the deal and reopen his borders.
This situation is like a pressure cooker. At the moment, Turkey is controlling the pressure. But if Europe applies too much heat, then the cooker will explode.
It's just a few miles across the sea from Izmir to the nearest Greek island and the European Union. Now, officials in the port tell us that there are anywhere between 200 and 400,000 refugees in the city, and that 80% of them would make the journey to Greece immediately if they could. Some refugees who attempt the crossing do make it to Europe, but only just. Thousands of them are stuck on the edge of the island of Chios because the old migrant routes further into the European Union have been closed off. What's stopping you from leaving here now?
Okay, what's stopping? The police. Actually, the police.
The police won't let you leave this island?
Yeah. Because he said Europe countries don't want refugees now anymore.
The camps here are overflowing, so tents are pitched on the shoreline. Europe is trying to hold the refugee crisis at bay, but Turkey might yet choose to give it a push. Geraint Vincent, News at 10, Chios.
Back here, the head of schools inspection in England has made waves before, but he came out with a rather startling suggestion today, which was that the vote to leave the EU was tied up with an alienation in less affluent areas with the education system. Sir Michael Wilshaw, who's just about to stand down from Ofsted, says there has been resentment at the north-south divide. It is his last report, and I think it's fair to say he wasn't holding too much back.
Michael Wilshaw's end-of-term report as Chief Inspector of Schools is uncompromising. Back in the London Academy, he turned round as its head teacher. He told me millions of children were disadvantaged by the north-south divide.
Do you think that the north-south divide feeds into a general sense that the political elite is only interested in themselves, and the referendum kind of was born from that?
I think that's absolutely right. If I was a parent of a youngster, a secondary school youngster in the Midlands and the North, I'd look at the provision my youngster was receiving compared to London and the south of England. The differential is as bad as it was last year and getting wider. And that's feeding into a wider resentment about the establishment, about Westminster, about people not caring about what's happening in parts of the north.
His other target was further education. And in his last week as Chief Inspector, he visited an FE college to highlight the fact that nearly half of colleges Ofsted inspected this year were judged less than good.
If we're serious about improving education in schools, if we're serious about improving productivity in our nation, we've got to sort this one out. It's a failing part of our system. It is the Cinderella end of the system. And rather than worry about grammar schools, you know, for the top 5 to 10% of youngsters, worry about the huge numbers of children who go wanting to get a good education in general further education of colleges.
Sir Michael has been a tough and at times controversial Chief Inspector. Touring a school in Manchester, he called for there to be a new schools minister for the North to improve standards. He accepts that progress has been made elsewhere, though. He says 2 million more pupils are now in good or outstanding schools than when he started.
We've come a long way in 5 years, and children are getting a better deal now than ever before. More poor youngsters are going to university now than ever before. And if you look at places like this school in London, London schools, both primary and secondary, are doing very well. Are we there with the top nations in the world? Are we there with Shanghai and South Korea and the other top nations in the world? No, we're not.
His legacy as a head teacher here is still evident.
You were head teacher for our first 2 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Was I?
But after 5 years as Chief Inspector, his final verdict on English education: progress, yes, but not enough. Penny Marshall, News at 10, North London.
This next item is one of those reports that it's difficult not to find a bit well, chilling, frankly. You will no doubt recall the pictures on Tuesday of what was left of that plane that had been carrying a Brazilian football team. Well, today, video emerged of the players and flight crew smiling and laughing on the plane just before it took off. We also heard the last conversation between flight control and the pilot. A slightly clearer picture of what happened is emerging. Because of a delayed departure, 2 possible refuelling stops en route were abandoned. But 8 miles from the runway, the pilot radioed for immediate permission to land because he was running out of fuel. It was, of course, simply too late.
This was the scene on board before takeoff. On the way to the biggest game in the club's history, the team is in good spirits. And so is the crew. I think we'll return with good results, he says. Striker Kempes joins in. Being taken by Lamia makes it all right, he says. The co-pilot was filmed saying Lamia Airline is always transporting soccer teams and we're ready to offer them the best service. But instead, just hours later, the pilot makes this distress call to air traffic control. His voice calm, he tells the operator the electrics have failed and he's run out of fuel. The operator tries to help him land. But then the pilot's final word. "71 people died when the aircraft plunged into the Colombian mountainside. Brazil's O Globo newspaper reports the pilot declined 2 chances to refuel. This rescuer said he could hear people crying for help when he arrived at the scene. Several people at the rear part survived, he said. It was in fact 6 people, including 3 players. Relatives arrived in Colombia today to bring their loved ones home. All the players have now been identified and will return to Brazil in a military aircraft. They'll come directly to the club's home stadium for a service. The stadium that has now become a shrine. Tributes led by the few players left behind. Sally Lockwood, News at 10.
And the club's acting president said today its shirts have sold out, with fans around the world buying them in a show of support for the team. The suppliers, Umbro, say they are looking at ways of meeting demand. And finally, Joe Bartley isn't the first pensioner in the world to find life in retirement a little dull. He called it boring. About it, he put an advert in his local newspaper in Devon offering his services. And guess what? He's back at work already.
Arguably Britain's most famous unemployed pensioner is going back to work. His first interview in 20 years was a success, and Joe Bartley has a profession again.
I thought I'd be really nervous, but I'm taking it all in and I'm okay about it. Quite happy in a way. The way you feel when you won $1,000 on the horses or something like that.
Having done the face-to-face interview, the former soldier was given a warm welcome by his new colleagues and a guided tour by a delighted boss.
He's so keen. I mean, how often do you get a sort of an 89-year-old person approaching you and saying that I want to work? Usually we have to go out and find people, and then when we get them, sometimes they don't even want to work. But he's keen, and we just couldn't say no. How could we?
Since his desperate plea for work to stop him, quote, dying of boredom, was first revealed on ITV News on Monday, the widower has been overwhelmed by support from around the world. And as he learned the ropes this morning, customers were on his side.
I admire him very much, and I wish I had the courage to do the same, really.
I think it's great, yeah. He's a real character, and he'll be good for the place.
I think it's brilliant. I think there's so many people around like him that are lonely, and this is a lovely cafe for him to come and work in.
Joe Bartley wanted to pay his own way, not rely on benefits and get out of the house. Unafraid to ask for help, it came in ways he couldn't have imagined. And now the 89-year-old is looking forward to a new career.
I'll see you Sunday, first shift.
Rupert Evelyn, News at 10.
Brilliant story. I'm not sure I'll be here at 89, but I will be here tomorrow night. In the meantime, good night and thank you very much for watching.